Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the subject of spiritual walk versus spiritual talk. And the basic thing I want you to understand is that living a spiritual life is very different from reading about it, talking about it, thinking about it, fantasising about it. And I want you to make sure that you're not falling into this trap. This is a huge trap that I find very present in spiritual communities. And here's the basic problem. When you get into spirituality or, a spiritual practice like yoga or meditation, what is very seducing and tempting is to spend a lot of time reading about this stuff and to accumulate, the paraphernalia, the yoga mat, the meditation seat, the Indian cloves, the necklaces, and so on, things like this, and to decorate your house and, to buy a Buddha statue and to make your garden into some sort of Buddhist garden or yoga garden or whatever. Basically, you're creating the outer form of a spiritual life. But what's actually happening is you're not walking the path really. You're just talking about it. You're just thinking about it. You're focusing on the exterior stuff. And yes, reading books and taking courses and going to this talk and that talk and talking about this teacher and that teacher and studying what they all talk about is also part of this trap. And it's something that I've seen both as a meditation teacher in my students and as just a person, in my friends and my family and so on. It's very tempting to read spiritual books and to listen to the teachers, what they're saying, and to kind of get seduced by the language and think that being seduced by the language and finding it exciting and appealing is the real thing. Let's be honest, whatever spiritual school you're studying, perhaps the original Buddhist teachings don't fall into this so much, but pretty much any sort of spiritual teacher or school that you're studying, the language is all very sexy. And I've actually done an entire episode called Why Enlightenment is Not Sexy. And you could say, well, the same thing as, well, why spirituality is not sexy. The language sounds very sexy because you have to use words that are sort of not in our usual daily vocabulary to try and describe certain experiences or certain realizations that you can have through spiritual practice. And basically this language creates, it creates a sense of expectation and it creates sort of excitement and a sort of fascination, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But as a spiritual person, as a seeker, what can happen is you just get lost in the language and you end up, you know all the quotes from all the teachers and you know all the language and you can talk about it, you tell people about it, and you sort of count up all the books you've been reading and you tell people, oh, have you read that book? Have you read this book? What about this teacher? What about that other teacher? But you're not really going into the practice. Funny story that I've had that came about through my teaching meditation is I'm going to try and keep this person as anonymous as possible because it's not really necessarily you know them and I don't want to name names, but basically what happened was someone came to one of my meditation classes. And what happens when someone comes for the first time is that usually you end up talking to them quite a lot, either before the class or after, just, to get to know each other a bit, and they often ask you questions and, the other way around. So you end up talking for a bit. And I remember this particular student that came, they started asking me, have you read this book? Have you read that book? Have you done this? Have you done that? And most of it I hadn't actually read or even really heard of, to be quite honest. And the sort of impression I got was that they weren't comfortable with that. It's like, if I hadn't read all the books from all these different traditions or people, they sort of, I don't know, there was this air of they didn't really feel comfortable with that. And it turned out later on in the conversation that they hadn't actually done much meditation. And so I was like, well, okay, cool. Maybe this is an example of the typical talking the spiritual talk, not really walking the walk type thing. And the person didn't come to any other classes, and I've not seen them since. However, they did send me an email. Basically, they'd been on a retreat and they wanted to meet up with me to have a coffee and to talk about the retreat that they did. Now, listen, fair dues for going on the retreat. That's a big, it can be a very powerful experience, can be very transformative, and it can deepen your practice just going on one retreat. So great that they did that. But what I noticed was they wanted to meet up and talk about it. They didn't, I just think, what is there to talk about? You're better to keep it to yourself and continue practicing. I'm not saying that talking about these things isn't useful, but my first thing was, well, you're not coming to my classes, and from the sound of it, you're not going to any other classes, and you've not really got a regular meditation practice. So meeting up to talk about it is kind of like the secondary thing. Like if you already had a regular practice, say, okay, maybe we can meet up and talk about it. There's something to talk about, and you've at least got your priorities straight. But that wasn't happening from my point of view, and I actually said no. I said no. I think you're better, instead of talking about it, you're better establishing a daily practice, and then if you want to talk about it after, you're welcome. But I didn't want to put them deeper into that mindset of talking and reading and studying and not actually doing the work on every single day. And yes, I've met many people like this on my, not just as a teacher, but as a person, just as, friends. Many people who, they've got a cabinet full of all these books about spirituality, but I have to be honest, they've got no spiritual embodiment whatsoever. They don't really understand, things like the no self or emptiness or pure awareness or Buddha mind, Christ consciousness, whatever you want to point to these things. They just, they have all the sort of terminology and the paraphernalia, but they have no experience of what these things are. And in my opinion, it's because their regular practice is reading books. It's not meditation or doing real yoga, not any type of yoga. Doing meditation or some sort of like contemplative type of yoga, perhaps. They've not got that. And so all these concepts and ideas, they're really useless. It's funny because it reminds me of a very innocent example of this, and you can choose anything either from your childhood or your, any hobby you have. There's something very interesting that happens in sports and in different hobbies. And this was very poignant for me in my childhood. In my case, it was with football. Everyone in the UK, when you're young, pretty much everyone, especially boys, play football, right? So for many years when I was younger, I played football. And it was interesting because I was one of the better players in like my school and in my local team for most of the time that I was a player. But at the same time, I wasn't from a particularly wealthy family. And so they couldn't buy me sort of the fancy equipment that other kids had. Usually the football boots were like the fancy thing, but it was also like football kits and the tracksuit and whatever. I never really used to have expensive stuff like that. I would just whatever I could get my hands on, I would put on, and I would just go out and play. And it's funny because this exact phenomenon happened all those years ago. You'd always have the kids who loved, they knew all this sort of, they knew what was going on in the world of football, and they had like the latest football boots. Every 6 months they'd be getting the latest football boots. It probably cost like £70, at a time in their life when their feet are growing all the time. And what would always happen is the kids with, the fanciest stuff, and they talked about it the most, and they were sort of the posers, they liked doing like the fancy tricks, and they liked, copying like the famous footballers and whatever. They were actually usually among the worst of all the football players. And you can think of any sort of hobby that you have, any sport that you're interested in, anything that, even in your profession, this might happen. It's like the loudest people and the ones who show off the most and the ones who present this image are usually the ones, I mean, listen, this is probably a generalization, but often I've found that they're the ones that actually are quite mediocre, because they replace the actual practice and the day-to-day, skill building and immersion in the thing, in the pursuit, in the hobby, in the profession. They sort of, they either they're not aware of it, the importance of it, or they just don't like doing it, and they don't feel like they get sort of recognition from it from other people. So they create this veneer around them and they present that to everyone. But when you actually look a bit sort of beyond the veneer, there's nothing really there. There's like they don't know what they're really doing or talking about. And the exact same thing can happen with spirituality. However you choose to practice it. In my case, I'm a meditator, and I found it's meditation is tough. I've been doing it for nearly 10 years, and it's still not, I wouldn't call it easy. And it's easier to sit and read books about it and to sort of enjoy the concepts and the ideas and whatever, and not do the practice. In my case, that is not true, because I've done it for about 500 days in a row now. And I've had regular meditation practice for many years, but I still know that it's easier to read about it than to actually do it. But the crucial thing is that, yes, the reading is important, but once you actually contact the things that these, often sexy sounding books and texts are talking about, you realize that actually they cannot describe it adequately. These things cannot be described adequately. It's almost like trying to describe, how do you tie your shoelaces? Try and think of an adequate description for that actually sort of really accurately mimics the process of doing it, and it would take you to actually being able to do it. I bet you can, because actually the way you tie your shoelaces, the way you learn to tie them is just through trial and error. And you don't need formal, guidelines and structures and rules for tying your shoelaces. You just need a bit of someone shows you how to do it, then you learn how to do it, then you practice and repeat it, and eventually you can do it without thinking about it. And any language used to describe it is it's useless and it's unnecessary, because you know how to do it. The exact same thing is happening in meditation or in any other kind of spiritual practice. Once you've practiced enough, with the right guidelines, of course, so I'm not denying the need for like theory and a background and a framework, but once you've practiced enough, the framework just falls away, because you realize that it cannot adequately describe what it's really trying to describe, and it cannot replace direct experience. And the direct experience is what you're really after in any case. So how do you know, just to finish off here, how do you know if you're falling into this trap of talking about spirituality, reading about spirituality, fantasizing about it, versus actually doing it. There's something very simple that I encourage every single person to do. Have a regular practice. In my case, meditation, daily meditation. I do meditation every day, sitting, and as I'm going about my day, as I'm doing some sort of task, as I'm walking about the city in a sort of informal way. I do that every single day. If you've got a regular practice, you're doing it a lot right. You're doing a lot right. You're well on the way, not to just talking about spirituality, but to walking the path. Also, are you talking about it too much to other people? Are you like desperate to share your knowledge? Are you desperate to like show off about what you've come to understand, and about this book you've read, and about that wonderful meditation you've had? Don't talk so much. Really try to focus on cultivating the attention and the state of mind that you need to realize these things. Don't talk about it so much. Don't let it leak out. If people ask you, tell them, but don't go like running around telling everyone about all this great stuff that you're discovering. Let it marinate inside you, and then you won't have to tell people. You won't have to preach to them. They'll know that there's something there, that there's a transformation that's happened. And I'd also say, be careful about dabbling with too many traditions. I think in my case, in meditation, my two traditions are mindfulness and Dzogchen. Spent about 7 or 8 years just studying mindfulness, and this year I've been studying Dzogchen, which is a school of Tibetan Buddhism. I've got some guided meditations on the channel if you want to check those out, see what Dzogchen is about. But in my opinion, if I'm straying too far into other schools of meditation, and there are many of them, I'm not going to really master anything. I'm just going to know a little bit about them all, and maybe practice meditation from all these different schools, but I'm not going to really get it. I'm not going to be an expert, and I don't want that. And I think we can all apply that by just saying, right, let me focus on this year. Let me focus on one particular style of meditation, and let me read about that, and let me practice that. And let me be very focused in how I do that, and let me be disciplined about that. I'm exploring, but I'm also doing it within that particular tradition. And that way you're going to have a strong like a strong guideline, a strong framework for how to do it, but you're not going to get tempted by the spiritual talk and not really focusing on the spiritual walk. Alright, I think that's all I wanted to say on this. The main message I want you to take away is that daily practice is essential, and if you're not doing daily practice, in my opinion, you're not really walking the spiritual path. Thanks a lot for joining me. I hope you enjoy the channel. Please check out my other videos for lots of free discussions on this stuff. I've actually done a lot of videos recently about, enlightenment, spirituality. That wasn't really planned. It's just been a huge theme in my life, and just things I want to share. And this particular episode is another edition of that. Thanks a lot. Take care, and we will be back together soon.